The encounter at Union Savings Bank. Manhattan, New York, was a city of many contrasts, a bustling metropolis where dreams and ambitions soared as high as its skyscrapers, but also where divisions ran deep beneath the surface. In the midst of this urban jungle, Union Savings Bank stood like an impenetrable fortress, a gleaming symbol of wealth and exclusivity. The sleek lines of its modern design, minimalist and imposing, were a far cry from the grimy streets outside. Here, only the privileged few were welcomed, and the rest were left to fight for a place in a world that never truly seemed to acknowledge their existence. Among the patrons that day was Alina Brooks. At 36, Alina had built a reputation for herself as an entrepreneur with an unrelenting work ethic and a knack for turning small ventures into lucrative businesses. She had established a growing chain of gourmet coffee shops that dotted the streets of New York City, offering more than just coffee, but a taste of something unique and refined in an industry often dominated by corporate giants. Alina wasn't just an entrepreneur. She was a force to be reckoned with, a black woman who had defied the odds stacked against her, and she had earned every bit of her success. As she stepped into the cool, marble-floored interior of Union Savings Bank, Alina could feel the weight of the space pressing down on her. It wasn't the physical weight, but the invisible barrier that separated the people who belonged here from those who didn't. The polished silver pillars, the subdued hum of the air conditioning, the sharp suits of executives. Everything about this place screamed exclusivity. Alina had been to countless banks in her career, from small-town branches to high-end institutions, but something about Union Savings felt different. It wasn't just the wealth. It was the unspoken sense of superiority that hung in the air, the invisible line that determined who was worthy and who was not. Despite her accomplishments, Alina couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. She had grown used to this feeling in many ways, having navigated a world that often dismissed her because of the color of her skin. She had learned to push past the prejudices and biases, to rise above them. But still, they lingered in the back of her mind, creeping up when she least expected them. Today, she was at Union Savings to deposit a significant sum of cash from a recent deal, a deal that had taken months of negotiation and countless hours of hard work. Alina wasn't just here as a customer. She was a businesswoman with a purpose, and she expected the same level of respect and professionalism she extended to others. But as she made her way to the line, her eyes inadvertently met the gaze of one of the tellers, a man named Stephen Myers. He was in his 40s, wearing a crisp white shirt and a tie that screamed corporate affluence. His demeanor was cold, rigid, as if he was used to maintaining a professional distance from those around him, especially those who didn't fit the bank's typical clientele. Alina noticed how Stephen's eyes briefly flicked over her, and in that moment, she felt something shift in the air. It was subtle, but unmistakable. He didn't see her as a successful businesswoman. He saw her as something else. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she knew that his perception of her was clouded by something deeper, something ingrained, something that went beyond mere appearance. Alina had seen that look before, the look of someone who couldn't quite reconcile her presence with the image they had in their mind of who belonged in a place like this. She tried to push the feeling aside. She had no time for distractions. She was here to do business, not to engage in a battle of perception. But as she stood waiting for her turn, Alina couldn't help but observe the dynamics of the room. The bank was a study in contrasts. Powerful figures in tailored suits exchanging pleasantries while the staff maintained an almost robotic level of professionalism, as if the goal was to keep everything in order and neat, without a hint of emotion or deviation. When her name was called, Alina stepped forward with a polite smile. Her heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she approached the counter. The air between her and Stephen felt thick with unspoken tension, but she didn't let it show. She was used to having to prove herself, especially in spaces where she wasn't the typical client. "Good morning," she said, offering a friendly but firm greeting. Stephen barely acknowledged her. His eyes flicked over the stack of cash in her hands, and there was a subtle change in his expression, A momentary pause before he spoke. "What's the nature of this deposit?" His voice was clipped, neutral, but Elena couldn't ignore the undercurrent of judgment that laced his tone. "I'm depositing a payment from one of my business deals," Elena replied, keeping her voice steady. She slid the envelope across the counter, her gaze meeting his, unwavering. Stephen's fingers lingered on the envelope for a moment longer than necessary, and Elena could see the gears turning in his mind. There was something in his eyes, something calculating. He didn't ask for any further information about her business or the nature of the payment, and it didn't take Elena long to realize that he had already made up his mind. He hadn't even looked at her credentials or asked about her company's standing. His assumption was already formed. She didn't belong here, not in his eyes, not in a place like Union Savings Bank. As the minutes ticked by, Elena's patience began to thin. She had done everything right. She had followed the proper procedures, and yet here she was, being treated like an outsider, like an anomaly. It was a feeling she had become far too familiar with. The subtle racism, the microaggressions that piled up, one after another, until they became impossible to ignore. She had grown up in a world where her worth was often questioned because of the color of her skin. And now, even in this world she had carved out for herself, she was still being forced to prove her value. But Elena was no stranger to adversity. She had spent her life fighting against the odds, rising from the challenges of her upbringing to create something meaningful and successful. She wasn't about to let one bank teller, one man, diminish everything she had worked for. Her thoughts were interrupted when Stephen spoke again, his voice now tinged with condescension. "I'm going to need to check the authenticity of this deposit," he said, tapping the envelope with his finger. "Please wait here while I verify it." Elena's heart sank, but she kept her expression neutral. She had seen this before. The subtle dismissals, the insinuations, the barriers that were put in place for people like her. She wasn't going to let him get away with it. As she stood there, waiting, Elena made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this moment pass without standing up for herself. She had built her business from the ground up, had fought tooth and nail to gain respect, and she would not let a biased banker steal that from her. Unbeknownst to her, this was just the beginning of a much larger journey, one that would not only test her resilience but force everyone around her to reckon with the biases they held deep within. The decision that changed everything. Elena stood in the polished, pristine lobby of Union Savings Bank, her fingers idly tracing the smooth edge of the marble countertop as she waited. It had been several minutes since Stephen had taken her deposit, and the hum of the bank seemed to grow louder, the ticking of the wall clock more pronounced. It wasn't just the weight of the silence that bothered her. It was the feeling that something was off. She had been in high-end banks and luxury spaces before, but the air here felt colder, sharper, as though the people around her were playing a game that she wasn't invited to. She could feel her heartbeat steadying, each passing second allowing her to regain her focus. Elena was no stranger to being judged. She had fought against unfair expectations and stereotypes her whole life. As a black woman in business, she was accustomed to having to prove her worth time and again, whether it was in meetings with investors, partnerships, or even day-to-day interactions with vendors. People sometimes assumed her success was either a fluke or the result of someone else's help, never acknowledging the tireless effort it took to build her empire from scratch. But something about this situation, it felt different. Elena could sense that Stephen's refusal to take her deposit seriously was not just about money. It was about something deeper, something insidious, rooted in the biases that so often crept into the way people viewed her. She had expected the bank staff to be professional, courteous, and efficient, but instead, she felt like she was being scrutinized for every detail, treated as though she didn't belong. It was a feeling she had experienced too many times to ignore. Her thoughts were interrupted when Stephen reappeared, his face no longer neutral but masked with a sort of thinly veiled suspicion. He placed the envelope back on the counter, his fingers tapping it lightly. His tone was colder now, more formal. "I'm afraid I'll need some additional verification for this deposit," he said, the words sharp as though cutting through the thick tension in the air. Please provide your business registration and the relevant account information. Elena's stomach tightened. It wasn't the request itself that bothered her. It was the way it was phrased, as if her business wasn't legitimate enough to warrant a simple deposit. She had brought in clients from all over the world, including corporations and high-net-worth individuals. She had worked tirelessly to ensure her company was as professional and reputable as any of the businesses that came in and out of the doors of Union Savings Bank. And yet here she was, being treated like a fraud. I've already given you the necessary documentation, Elena replied, her voice calm but firm. This is a straightforward deposit from a client I've been working with for months. I don't see any reason why it should require further verification. Stephen didn't flinch, but there was a brief flicker of something in his eyes, something close to annoyance. I'm just following protocol, he said, his voice now taking on a defensive edge. I can't process the deposit without the proper verification. It's a simple procedure. Elena took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. She had learned over the years that keeping her cool was the best way to disarm those who sought to undermine her. But this was different. She could feel her blood pressure rising, and the injustice of it all weighed heavily on her. She wasn't just a black woman walking into a high-end space. She was an entrepreneur, a leader, someone who had earned every bit of the success she had. And she was not going to let anyone treat her like she was unworthy of respect. Her mind raced, trying to think of a way to address the situation without escalating things further. She knew that in many spaces, particularly in financial institutions, anything that even remotely resembled a confrontation could lead to immediate consequences. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, a bias that was impossible to ignore. Elena had encountered this many times before in various forms, but now, in a moment that was meant to be routine, she was being forced to confront it head-on. She could feel the eyes of the people around her, other customers, bank staff, settling on her, and the weight of their gaze added to the mounting pressure. Elena wasn't afraid of being the center of attention. She was used to it, but it wasn't her presence that bothered her now. It was the idea that her worth was being questioned in a place that was supposed to serve her as a customer, as a business owner, as someone who had earned her place at the table. "Is there something you'd like to say?" Elena asked, her voice calm but edged with the slightest hint of challenge. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it was firm, and Stephen could tell that she wasn't going to back down. Stephen hesitated for a moment, and then his lips tightened in a thin line. He glanced over his shoulder at the other tellers, his gaze flicking between Elena and his colleagues, as if seeking confirmation. Then, as if making a decision, he turned back to her. "I'll need to speak with my supervisor," he said, his words clipped. Elena nodded, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Of course. I'd appreciate that." She had hoped that this would be a simple resolution, an apology, an acknowledgement of the oversight, and then everything would proceed as it should. But deep down, Elena knew that things weren't so easily settled. The issue was no longer just about the deposit. It was about the unspoken biases that shaped the way people saw her, and more importantly, how those biases were allowed to persist in places of power and influence. She wasn't going to let it slide. Not today. Not anymore. A few minutes later, Stephen returned, this time accompanied by a woman in her 50s, dressed in a crisp navy suit. The woman's presence immediately commanded attention. She had an air of authority about her that made Elena sit up straighter. The supervisor, whose nameplate read Karen Williams, took one look at Elena, then at Stephen, and without a word, began to examine the envelope with the same detached air that Elena had already come to expect. "I understand there's an issue with this deposit." Karen's voice was smooth, almost too smooth, but there was no warmth in it. She glanced at Elena, her eyes assessing, before returning her gaze to the paperwork. "I'm afraid our policy requires a thorough review in cases of large deposits." Elena could feel her patience slipping. She had been polite, accommodating, and had provided all the necessary documentation. But now, standing in front of her, was yet another person who seemed more interested in upholding an invisible set of rules than in actually understanding the situation. "I've already provided all the required information," Elena said, her voice maintaining a steady calm. "If you need to verify anything, I'll be happy to provide you with additional documentation. But I expect this to be handled with the same level of respect and professionalism you would show any other client." For a moment, Karen hesitated. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Elena could feel her heart pounding in her chest, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let them walk all over her. Not today. Finally, Karen spoke. "I understand," she said, her tone slightly softer, but there was still a hint of reluctance. "I'll have this processed immediately. Thank you for your patience." Elena nodded, but the words she had expected to hear, a simple apology, a recognition of the oversight, never came. Karen turned away to handle the deposit, and Elena was left standing there, unsure of what to feel. Was this resolution? Was this the acknowledgement she had hoped for? Or was it just another instance of someone trying to sweep their biases under the rug, hoping that she would simply accept it and move on? As the minutes ticked by and the transaction was finally completed, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter wasn't over. There was a deeper issue at play here, one that needed to be addressed, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Not now. Not ever again. The unseen battle. The doors of Union Savings Bank slid shut behind Elena with a soft hiss as she stepped out into the bustling streets of Manhattan. The sounds of the city flooded her senses. The honking of taxis, the clattering of heels on pavement, the constant hum of voices in 1,000 different languages, all blending together in a chaotic symphony. She paused for a moment, taking in the towering skyscrapers around her, the very symbols of power and wealth that had once made her dream of a life like this, a life where she didn't have to fight for respect, where her success wasn't questioned simply because of the color of her skin. But today, as she stood outside the glass doors of Union Savings Bank, Elena was reminded of how far there still was to go. The ordeal inside had been a stark reminder that no matter how far she had come, no matter how much she had achieved, the world would still find ways to make her prove herself. That something as simple as a routine deposit could turn into a moment of judgment, scrutiny, and disrespect. She hadn't expected an apology. After all, she had lived long enough to know that apologies for discrimination were rare and seldom heartfelt. What she had hoped for was something different: recognition, acknowledgement, an acknowledgement that her presence, her success, her business had earned her a seat at the table. But instead, she had been treated like an intruder. Elena's mind raced as she made her way down the sidewalk, her sharp heels clicking against the concrete. She could feel the weight of the interaction pressing down on her chest, the sting of every subtle glance and dismissive gesture lingering in her mind. She had been calm, controlled, professional, but beneath the surface, a storm was brewing. She could feel the old frustration rising, the anger she had learned to keep buried for so many years. She had fought too hard to be where she was, to have it all stripped away in a matter of minutes. She wasn't just angry about the deposit. She wasn't even just angry about how she had been treated. No, it was more than that. It was the cumulative weight of a lifetime of experiences, the subtle microaggressions, the moments when her authority had been questioned, the times when her presence had been dismissed or overlooked. It was the fact that in a city as diverse and dynamic as New York, these things still happened. And they happened to her. They happened to people who looked like her. As she walked, Elena's thoughts turned inward. She replayed the encounter over and over in her mind. Stephen's dismissive attitude, Karen's cool, almost indifferent demeanor. There had been a moment when Stephen had first taken the deposit, when Elena had seen something shift in his eyes, a flicker of judgment, a hesitation. And that moment, however fleeting, had spoken volumes. It wasn't about the paperwork. It wasn't about the deposit. It was about who Elena Brooks was in his eyes. A black woman who didn't fit the mold of the people he was accustomed to seeing in his bank, the people who were worthy of respect. Alina's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden beep from her phone. She glanced down at the screen and saw a text message from her assistant, Maya. "Hi Alina, just wanted to check in. How's everything going with the deposit at Union Savings? Let me know if you need anything." Alina paused for a moment, staring at the message. Maya was one of the few people she could truly rely on, loyal, intelligent, and fiercely protective of Alina's business. She had worked alongside Alina for years, helping manage the day-to-day operations of the coffee shops. Maya knew all too well the struggles Alina faced in the business world, struggles that often had nothing to do with the work they did, but everything to do with the way others perceived them. Alina paused, her finger hovering over the keyboard. Should she tell Maya what had just happened? Should she share the anger and frustration she felt? Part of her wanted to vent, to unleash the fury that had been building inside her. But another part of her knew that, for better or worse, she had to keep it together. She had to keep moving forward. Her business was too important, her vision too vast, to let one incident hold her back. She typed quickly, "It's fine. I'll take care of it. Everything's handled." Alina hit send and then stared at the screen for a long moment, her mind swirling with thoughts of what had happened, what might happen next. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Her coffee shops needed her attention. Her clients needed her focus. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something more needed to be done. This wasn't just about one teller or one supervisor. It was about a system that allowed people like Stephen and Karen to exist in positions of power and authority, able to treat customers with such blatant disregard. As Alina continued her walk through the crowded streets of Manhattan, a thought began to form in her mind. She wasn't one to back down. She never had been. And this moment, felt like a turning point. She had been through too much to let something like this pass unnoticed. Later that afternoon, as she sat in her office overlooking the city, Alina made a decision. She would take action. She wouldn't let this go. There was too much at stake, not just for her, but for every person who had ever been treated unfairly, who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Alina had worked tirelessly to build her reputation and her business, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially not someone with as little power as Stephen Myers, tarnish it. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. People like Stephen and Karen needed to understand that their actions had consequences. If she let this go, it would only embolden the next person who thought they could treat her, or anyone like her, with disrespect. Alina's hand moved over her desk, and she began drafting an email to Union Savings Bank. She kept it professional, yet firm, outlining exactly what had happened and how she felt about the treatment she had received. She wasn't just asking for an apology. She was demanding that the bank take responsibility for the actions of its employees and reevaluate how they interacted with clients from all walks of life. The email was long, more than she had initially intended, but it was precise. She wrote about her experience, her business, and the steps she was prepared to take if they didn't address the issue. Alina knew that the odds of receiving a prompt and meaningful response were slim, but that wasn't her primary concern. Her primary concern was making sure her voice was heard, and that those in positions of power knew that their actions would not go unchallenged. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city below her. There was a strange sense of peace that settled over her as she did so. This wasn't just about this one incident. It was about changing the way people like her were treated in spaces where power and privilege dominated. It was about making sure that every person who walked into a bank, a store, a corporate office, or any other space where decisions were made, was treated with the same respect and fairness as anyone else. But Alina knew that this was just the beginning. She could already hear the whispers, see the side glances. She had no doubt that the response from Union Savings would be as predictable as it was dismissive. But she wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not when she was so close to making a real difference. not when so many others had fought and bled for her to be able to stand in this position of power. The ripple effect. The next few days passed in a blur. Alina buried herself in work, meetings with suppliers, the opening of a new location for her coffee chain, and a string of calls from clients. She kept her focus sharp, her mind steadfast, determined not to let the incident at Union Savings Bank distract her. But despite her best efforts to compartmentalize, she couldn't shake the lingering feeling that something had shifted inside her. A quiet resolve had taken root, a sense that this was no longer just about her. It was about something larger, something that reached far beyond the marble walls of a high-end bank or the polished floors of her coffee shops. Every so often, when she had a quiet moment, her thoughts would return to the encounter with Stephen and Karen. She had received no immediate response from the bank. Not that she had expected one. Alina knew how systems like these operated, slow, bureaucratic, and indifferent to the needs of the individuals caught in their gears. But she had already resolved that this wouldn't be the end of it. She had a message to send, not just to Union Savings Bank, but to anyone who might dismiss her or anyone else for the mere crime of being different. Her phone buzzed in the middle of a meeting, pulling her attention momentarily away from a strategy session with Maya. Alina glanced down, her heart skipping a beat as she saw the name on the screen. Union Savings Bank. She held her breath for a moment, then excused herself from the table, stepping into the hallway of the coffee shop's headquarters. "Hello, this is Alina Brooks," she said, her voice professional yet measured. "Alina." The voice on the other end was deep and authoritative. "This is Karen Williams, the supervisor you spoke to the other day at Union Savings. I'm calling in response to the email you sent." There was a slight pause, a hint of tension in her voice that Alina couldn't quite place. "I wanted to personally apologize for the way your deposit was handled. It was never our intention to make you feel unwelcome or disrespectful in any way." Alina's grip tightened on her phone, but she remained silent. The apology, while appreciated, didn't carry the weight she had hoped for. She had expected it to be more genuine, more introspective, but the way Karen had delivered it felt almost scripted. "I understand your concern," Karen continued. "And after reviewing the situation, I've spoken to Stephen and addressed the matter with him. We've taken the necessary steps to ensure that this sort of situation doesn't occur again in the future." Alina's mind raced. The vague language, the avoidance of specifics. Nothing in Karen's response seemed like it was enough to make a real difference. It felt like they were just checking off a box, going through the motions to appease her without actually changing anything. "I appreciate your apology, Karen," Alina said carefully. "But what I really want is to understand what steps Union Savings is taking to address this kind of behavior long term. How are you ensuring that your employees are trained to treat all customers with the respect they deserve, regardless of who they are?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Alina could almost hear the wheels turning in Karen's mind as she tried to come up with a response that would satisfy Alina's pointed questions. "We're going to be reviewing our internal training protocols and making sure that all of our staff is aware of our commitment to diversity and inclusion," Karen said, her voice a little more guarded now. "I'll also personally oversee the training of Stephen and the other tellers to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again." Alina's thoughts swirled. While it was a start, she wasn't convinced. She had heard these promises before, heard them from companies, organizations, even individuals who had been caught in the act of discrimination or bias. The real question was whether or not they would actually follow through. "I appreciate that," Alina replied, keeping her tone even. "But I think it's important that you understand that this isn't just about the deposit or even about Stephen. It's about the culture you've built at Union Savings, a culture that, whether intentionally or not, made me feel like I didn't belong." She let the words hang in the air, giving Karen a moment to process. "I agree with you," Karen said finally, her voice tinged with what sounded like regret. "And we'll make sure to take a closer look at how we can improve." Alina nodded, though she knew the conversation wasn't over. She had started something. Now it was time to see if Union Savings Bank would put their money where their mouth was, or if they would simply go back to business as usual. As the days passed, Alina found herself grappling with something deeper. She had expected to feel relief after the conversation, but instead, she felt a strange sense of unease. The apology felt like a formality, an obligatory step in the process, but the actions behind it were still up in the air. What if nothing changed? What if Karen's words were just empty promises meant to placate her, to buy time until the heat of the situation died down? But then Alina remembered why she had started this in the first place. It wasn't just about the deposit, or even just about Union Savings Bank. It was about making sure that this type of behavior wasn't just swept under the rug. It was about forcing people to confront their biases and holding them accountable for how they treat others. She sat at her desk late one evening, the soft hum of the city drifting in through her office window, when she had an idea. An idea that would make sure this wasn't just another anonymous email or a single conversation with a bank manager that would soon be forgotten. She needed to take it a step further, to make her voice heard in a way that demanded action. The following day, Alina reached out to a journalist she knew at the New York Times, a woman named Olivia Thompson, who had covered stories about inequality and corporate bias in the past. Alina carefully explained what had happened to her at Union Savings Bank and shared the lackluster response she had received. Olivia was intrigued by the story and agreed to look into it, offering to write an exposé about the incident and the wider issue of bias in financial institutions. It wasn't a decision Alina made lightly. She knew that exposing what had happened to her would bring attention, both positive and negative. There would be backlash, especially from those who were invested in maintaining the status quo. But Alina had never shied away from difficult decisions, and this felt like the right moment to stand up for what was right. It was bigger than her. It was about raising awareness and making sure that other people didn't have to endure the same treatment she had. Olivia's article went live a week later. The headline read, "When a black entrepreneur was denied service at a high-end bank, it sparked a conversation about bias in financial institutions." The piece was comprehensive, shedding light on Alina's experience, her efforts to challenge the bank, and the systemic issues that led to such discriminatory practices. It didn't just focus on Alina's personal story. It took a hard look at how institutions like Union Savings Bank perpetuate inequality through subtle and not-so-subtle biases. The fallout was immediate. Alina's story spread like wildfire across social media, drawing both support and criticism. Messages of solidarity poured in from other entrepreneurs, activists, and everyday people who had faced similar experiences. But there were also those who tried to discredit her, calling her too sensitive or overreacting. Some defended Union Savings, claiming that the issue had been blown out of proportion. But Alina wasn't deterred. For every negative comment, there were 10 more that fueled her determination. The attention surrounding the article forced Union Savings Bank to make an official statement. They issued a public apology, announcing that they would be implementing diversity training programs for all employees and working with consultants to reassess their practices. But the real change, Alina knew, would come not from the words they spoke, but from the actions they took, or failed to take, in the months to come. Alina watched it all unfold, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in a conversation that was long overdue. It was no longer just about one bank or one incident. It was about making sure that the next time someone walked into a high-end institution, they wouldn't have to worry about being treated like they didn't belong. It was about changing the culture. And Alina knew that this was only the beginning. The turning point. The week following Olivia's article felt like an emotional roller coaster for Alina. As the story spread, so did the reactions. It was as if her life had been divided into two distinct halves, the world before the article and the world after. Before, her days had been filled with the grind of entrepreneurship, tackling logistical challenges, keeping up with the demands of her coffee shop chain, and striving to grow her brand in an ever-competitive market. After the article, things changed. Elena's name was now linked to something much larger than her business, a movement. She had expected the usual flurry of media attention that followed a high-profile story. What she hadn't anticipated was the depth of emotional investment that so many strangers, people she would never meet, had in her story. Social media had become a battlefield, with people sharing their personal experiences of discrimination and bias, using Elena's story as a springboard for their own narratives. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. Elena had gone from feeling isolated in her experience to realizing that she was part of something much bigger. She wasn't alone. However, with the support came the inevitable backlash. Some argued that Elena had overreacted, or that her complaint was an example of playing the race card. Others tried to minimize her experience, claiming that it was simply a misunderstanding, or that her perception had been skewed by her own biases. The most vicious responses came from anonymous accounts that accused her of trying to ruin someone's career or fame chasing. Despite the hate, Elena stayed strong. She refused to let the detractors drown out the chorus of people who had reached out to her with messages of gratitude, understanding, and shared experiences. It was hard not to internalize the negativity. Some days, she would wake up to find dozens of harsh comments and insults on her social media posts. But each time she started to doubt herself, she would remember why she was doing this. In the midst of the online storm, Elena received a call from an unexpected source. Stephen Myers, the Union Savings Bank teller who had been the catalyst for this entire chain of events. Elena had no idea what to expect. She had assumed that the bank's leadership had taken the necessary steps to address the issue. She didn't think for a second that Stephen would personally reach out to her. But there he was, on the other end of the line, sounding surprisingly earnest. "Elena, I just wanted to call and apologize," he said, his voice shaky. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I realize now how wrong I was. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I've learned a lot from this. I've been reading about unconscious bias and trying to understand where I went wrong. I know I treated you unfairly, and I deeply regret that." Elena was taken aback. She had expected a generic apology from someone in upper management, but not from Stephen himself. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, but Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was a moment of personal reckoning, not just corporate obligation. "Thank you for reaching out, Stephen," Elena said, her voice calm but firm. "But you need to understand that this wasn't just about what happened to me. It's about the culture that exists in places like Union Savings. Your actions weren't isolated. They reflect a larger issue that affects many people, and it's not just something that can be fixed with a simple apology." Stephen's voice faltered. "I know. I've been reading about this, and I can see that now. I didn't fully understand what I was doing, but I do now. And I promise you, I'm committed to doing better." Elena didn't know what to say at first. She had spent so much time fighting for justice and demanding accountability, but here she was, listening to the very person who had wronged her express regret. It was tempting to soften, to tell him that she forgave him, and that everything would be okay. But she had to stay true to the bigger picture, to the purpose she had found in this struggle. "I'm glad to hear that, Stephen," Elena said after a moment of silence. "But the real work starts now. It's not enough to just acknowledge your mistake. You have to take action. You need to use your position to influence others and make sure this doesn't happen again, not just with me, but with anyone. That's how you'll truly make a difference." Stephen agreed, his voice filled with resolve. "You're right. I'm going to do everything I can to make it right. Thank you for giving me the chance to learn from this." Elena hung up the phone feeling conflicted. Part of her wanted to believe that Stephen's change of heart was genuine, but another part of her remained skeptical. Change wasn't just about apologizing. It was about proving that you had learned from your mistakes and were committed to altering your behavior. Only time would tell if Stephen was willing to do the hard work necessary to transform. Days later, Elena received an unexpected invitation. Karen Williams, the Union Savings Bank supervisor, reached out to her, asking if Alina would be willing to meet in person to discuss the steps the bank was taking in response to the incident. Alina had already been in contact with Olivia Thompson, the journalist who had written the expose, and she knew that there was public pressure for Union Savings to follow through on their promises. Still, she was hesitant. She wasn't sure if meeting with Karen was a genuine attempt at reconciliation or just another PR move. But Alina was no stranger to difficult conversations. She agreed to the meeting, deciding that she would go in with her eyes wide open. She wasn't interested in empty words. She wanted to see real change. The meeting was set for a Friday afternoon, at a cafe just a few blocks from the Union Savings Bank branch, where Alina had first encountered Stephen. When Alina arrived, Karen was already seated at a small table, her laptop open in front of her. She stood as Alina approached, offering a warm but cautious handshake. "Alina, thank you for agreeing to meet," Karen said, her voice laced with professionalism, but also a hint of vulnerability. "I know that the last few weeks have been difficult, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the steps we're taking as a bank to address the issues you raised. Not just with you, but with all of our employees." Alina took a seat, her mind sharp and focused. She wasn't here to be impressed by promises. She was here to hold Union Savings accountable. "I appreciate that, Karen," Alina said, leaning forward. "But actions speak louder than words. What exactly is the bank doing to change the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place? What concrete steps are being taken to ensure that your employees are not only aware of unconscious bias, but are also equipped to address it?" Karen took a deep breath and then began to outline the bank's plan. She spoke about diversity and inclusion workshops for all employees, mandatory unconscious bias training, and new customer service protocols designed to ensure that every customer, regardless of race or background, would receive equal treatment. She also mentioned that Stephen had voluntarily signed up for an advanced course on diversity in the workplace, which she claimed would be required for all employees in the future. Alina listened intently, weighing each word. While she appreciated the actions being taken, she couldn't help but wonder if this would be another case of corporate talk with little follow-through. After all, it was easy to say the right things, but the proof would be in the results. "I'm glad to hear that these measures are being implemented," Alina said, her voice steady. "But I think the real test will be whether or not the culture actually changes within the bank. Are you willing to be transparent with your progress and show the public that you are committed to real change?" Karen nodded earnestly. "Yes, Alina. We're committed to being transparent, and we'll make regular reports on our progress available to the public. This is just the beginning, but I promise you, we're taking this seriously." As Alina walked out of the cafe, the weight of the conversation lingered in her mind. She had heard enough corporate promises in her lifetime to be wary of them, but something in Karen's tone had felt different. There had been a hint of vulnerability, a recognition that the bank was at a crossroads. Whether Union Savings would live up to its promises remained to be seen, but Alina was determined to keep the pressure on, to make sure they did not forget the lessons of this moment. She knew that this battle was far from over. It was one step in a larger journey, a journey toward a world where discrimination, bias, and prejudice no longer had a place, and Alina was committed to seeing it through, no matter how long it took. A new beginning. The weeks that followed the meeting with Karen Williams were a whirlwind. Alina's life had transformed in ways she never could have predicted when she first walked into Union Savings Bank with her deposit. What started as a moment of injustice had evolved into a much larger conversation about systemic bias, corporate accountability, and the power of speaking up. And through it all, Alina had remained resolute. The battle was far from over, but she was no longer fighting it alone. Her social media feeds were flooded with stories of people who had faced similar discrimination. Small business owners, professionals, and ordinary people from all walks of life shared their experiences with bias, many of them offering thanks to Alina for bringing attention to issues they had long felt powerless to address. It was overwhelming, in the best way possible. The sense of solidarity, the realization that her story had sparked a much-needed conversation, fueled her determination to keep pushing for real change. Alina's phone buzzed with an email notification one morning. She looked down at the subject line. Response from Union Savings. Action plan update. It was from Karen, the same supervisor who had met with Alina a few weeks earlier. The email was concise but filled with details of the steps Union Savings Bank had taken in response to her complaints. There were updates about diversity workshops, a revamped customer service training program, and most notably, a new policy requiring all tellers and employees to undergo unconscious bias training, not just as a one-time event, but as an ongoing process. The email also included an invitation for Alina to speak at one of their upcoming training sessions, where she could share her perspective and experiences firsthand. Alina read through the email twice, her mind racing. She hadn't expected a personal invitation to participate in their training sessions, let alone a commitment to sustain change. As she mulled over the offer, she felt a strange sense of pride. Not because of what she had done. Alina wasn't in this for accolades or recognition, but because she had forced a powerful institution to confront its own failings. She had made them listen, and now they were committed to taking action. Still, Alina was cautious. A part of her wondered if this was just another gesture, another PR move designed to placate her and the public until the heat died down. She knew that words were easy. The real work came in the follow-through. And so, while she was cautiously optimistic, she wasn't ready to let her guard down. A few days later, Alina received another unexpected call. This time, it was Stephen Myers, the teller who had initially denied her service. "Hi, Alina, it's Stephen," he said, sounding more at ease than when they had spoken last. "I just wanted to update you on something. After you and I spoke, I enrolled in that diversity training course like I promised. I've also started reading more about unconscious bias and ways to check myself in situations like what happened with you. It's been a real eye-opener." Alina felt a pang of surprise, mixed with skepticism. It wasn't often that people, particularly in positions like Stephen's, took ownership of their actions in such an honest and unprompted way. But as Stephen spoke about the changes he was trying to implement in his own life, Alina felt something shift inside her. Maybe this could be real change. Maybe it didn't have to be some abstract, distant ideal. "I'm glad to hear that, Stephen," Alina said, her voice soft but firm. "But I need to be honest with you. This isn't just about you and me anymore. It's about ensuring that this doesn't happen to anyone else. The only way we can move forward is if we're all actively working toward creating a more inclusive environment. This is about more than just one apology. It's about a collective shift in how we view and treat people who don't look like us." Stephen was quiet for a moment, clearly reflecting on her words. "I understand. And I agree with you. I'm doing the work, but I know it's a long road. I'm committed to it, though. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure I don't make that mistake again." Alina nodded to herself, though Stephen couldn't see it. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, but her skepticism remained. True change, she knew, was a process, not an event. She couldn't expect him to transform overnight, but she had to trust that he was taking the right steps. In the weeks that followed, Alina's influence began to expand in ways she hadn't imagined. Her social media following grew rapidly, as more and more people connected with her message of fighting discrimination and bias in all its forms. Invitations to speak at conferences and panel discussions began pouring in. Alina had always been a private person, content to work behind the scenes to build her business. But now, her voice had become a tool for change, a beacon for those who needed it most. One afternoon, Alina sat in her office, reviewing some speaking requests. She had been invited to speak at several prominent events, business conferences, leadership summits, even universities interested in her perspective as an entrepreneur and advocate for social change. As she pondered which opportunities to pursue, Alina was struck by a thought. She had been so focused on what had happened at Union Savings, on the action she had forced the bank to take, that she hadn't stopped to consider the broader implications of her story. What was the next step? What was her ultimate goal in all of this? It wasn't just about holding union savings accountable. It was about raising awareness of the larger issue of systemic bias in corporate America. It was about giving people the tools they needed to recognize their own biases and take responsibility for their actions. Alina realized that she wasn't just a small business owner anymore. She had become a voice for the marginalized, a voice for anyone who had ever been overlooked, underestimated, or mistreated because of who they were. Alina set her laptop aside, stood up from her desk, and walked over to the window. The city below her buzzed with life, a sprawling metropolis of ambition and dreams, of triumph and failure. She could hear the honking horns, the conversations on the street, the distant hum of construction. But for the first time in a long while, Alina felt a sense of peace settle over her. The battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she had made a difference. She had started something. And she wasn't about to stop now. Later that week, Alina flew to Los Angeles to speak at a leadership conference focused on diversity and inclusion. As she stood on stage, looking out at the audience of executives, entrepreneurs, and professionals, she felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. This was her moment, not just to tell their story, but to challenge others to do better, to demand more from themselves and from the institutions they represented. When it was her turn to speak, Alina took a deep breath and stepped to the microphone. "I want to tell you all a story," she began. "It's about a woman who walked into a bank and was treated like she didn't belong, like she wasn't worthy of the same level of respect and courtesy as anyone else in that room. That woman is me. But this story is not just about what happened to me. It's about what happens every day to countless people who are judged, dismissed, and underestimated because of their skin color, their gender, their name, or their background." She paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. The truth is, none of us are immune to bias. We all carry it, consciously or unconsciously. But what defines us is what we do when we recognize it. Do we pretend it's not there, or do we face it head-on and make a commitment to do better? To be better. The room was silent. Alina could feel the weight of her words hanging in the air. Each of us has the power to make a difference, and it starts with us. Each of us taking responsibility for our actions. If we want to build truly inclusive spaces, it's not enough to just check a box. We have to dig deeper. We have to challenge our assumptions, confront our biases, and hold ourselves accountable. Only then can we create a world where everyone is truly treated as equals. Alina stepped away from the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. She had said what she needed to say. She had spoken not just for herself, but for everyone who had been made to feel less than. As the applause echoed through the conference hall, Alina realized that this was just the beginning of a much larger journey. Her fight for justice, for equality, for a better world had only just begun, and she was ready to see it through, no matter where the road took her.